There's one skill that every poker crusher has that losing or break-even players do not. It's not being able to read people or knowledge of theory or even work ethic. No, these are all good things, but it's much simpler. So I'm going to explain what this skill is, then I'm going to show how you can develop it by asking just 2 simple questions during hands. You don't need software, you don't need a solver, you don't need a fancy subscription, none of that. No, you just need your brain. Ready? Let's jump in. First, let's take 2 players. On one side, we have a novice player, and when he plays a hand, he thinks, betting is good because I get to win this pot a lot, so he bets. On the other side, we have a crusher, and when he plays a hand, he thinks a little bit differently. He's thinking, well, if I bet, X happens, and if I check, Y happens, then on the turn, Z happens, therefore, Y might be better than X. Can you see the difference? The novice player comes to a conclusion, then gives himself evidence the conclusion is good. He thinks 1 step ahead. The crusher, on the other hand, is able to weigh several options and plan multiple moves ahead. This is the skill. Chess, not checkers. All right, let me show you how to do this. So let's look at a hand, and we're playing 2-5, and we open it up on the button with 10-9 of spades to $25, and the big blind, a recreational player, is going to call. And the flop here comes ace-7 deuce rainbow. And I had a recent video where I was talking about I don't c-bet my range. This is the one board where I don't really c-bet my range, and a comment popped up, and this comment actually inspired the whole video. And the comment said something to the effect of ace-7 deuce rainbow. If the opponent will fold hands like pocket 3s and king-jack suited versus small bet, you are absolutely printing with a range bet here. 0 cents to develop a checking range in position with such range advantage and such an overfold from out of position. So yes, this is probably true. If we c-bet small on this board, our opponent will probably fold hands like king-jack suited or pocket 3s, which is pretty good for us. But before we just come to an answer and then just start trying to support our answer like the novice player here in our example, let's ask 2 questions. And asking just 2 questions allows us to build the skill, build the reps to be much more like the crusher. So what are the 2 questions we should be asking in every hand? Very, very simple. What is their range and what happens if? So let's go back to our hand now. And the first question we will ask is, what is their range? So we opened on the button. Our opponent defended from the big blind. This is going to be a recreational player. They're defending wide, so they have a wide range. Maybe something like this, defending something like 40% of hands from the big blind. We have not really narrowed down their range yet, except they probably don't have the bottom of their range, right? They don't have stuff like 10 deuce offsuit or 9 deuce offsuit because the stuff would mostly fold pre-flop. And they don't have the absolute top of the range, right? You see, they don't have aces. They don't really have kings. This stuff would 3-bet pre-flop, right? So we can eliminate some of the top. We can eliminate some of the bottom, but overall they have a wide range. All right, step 1 complete. We've got their range. Now we ask what happens if. First, what happens if we c-bet? Well, if we c-bet here, he's going to fold out a lot of weak stuff, which is okay for us, right? We fold out hands that are better. We fold out hands like pocket 4s, pocket 3s, king, queen, king, jack. We fold this stuff quite a bit, which is pretty good for us. So let's start building a little flow chart here. What happens if we c-bet? Well, he's going to fold a lot. The next scenario here could be if we c-bet and he check raises. Well, we just have 10 high. He probably has a strong hand on this board if he check raises. So we would just fold. We don't really have anything going on. So pretty easy so far. But what happens if he calls here? Well, if he calls here, we're going to get to the turn. We have 10 high. We don't really have any showdown value. So let's just play out this scenario. Well, we could keep barreling on the turn and we could choose a big size. But the problem with this size is because this board is so static and dry on the flop, he may have some traps. He may have some hands like pocket 7s, pocket deuces, ace-7 that just trap on this flop. So by betting big on this turn, we're going to fold out his 7x, his deuce x, etc. And we're going to get in a lot of money against his single pair ace-x that may fold the river. But the problem is when we overbet on this turn and he calls, well, he's just going to have a very, very strong range because he may just slow play on the flop because the board is so static and dry. And then we overbet on the turn, which when we bet big, our opponents are much less likely to fast play their strong hands, much more likely to call. So getting to this river, he may have a lot of hands like pocket 7s, pocket deuces, ace-7, ace deuce, ace queen, ace-6, right? He just has a lot of 2-pair sets, etc. getting to this river. So if we bet big on this river after overbetting the turn, we're just going to get snapped off by a very strong portion of his range. And if we bet small on this river, if we don't go all in, well, we're just getting called by hands like ace-jack, ace-10, ace-9, etc. So when we bet big on the turn, well, we don't really have any good options on this river. Okay, what if we bet small on the turn here? We bet small on the turn to incentivize him to start raising his 2-pair, ace-7, ace-deuce, pocket sevens, pocket deuces, etc. So we go small on the turn, we go half pot. Now the problem is getting to the river. The pot is going to be relatively small. He's going to have a lot of hands like 7x of clubs, deuce x of clubs. He's going to have some weak stuff on the river, but he's also going to have still some strong hands that wouldn't raise the turn. Hands like ace-king, ace-queen, that's now 2-pair. Even hands like ace-jack and ace-10. So what size do we bet on this river? Well, if we go big on this river, we just get snapped off by ace-queen, ace-king, etc. So going big, probably not great. If we go medium on this river, well, we're probably just getting called by ace-jack and ace-10 and that type of stuff that isn't going to fold to a triple barrel when we go small on the turn and medium on the river. And if we go small on the river, I guess that could be an option here. Maybe we just want to fold like 7x of clubs or deuce x of clubs, but that's really not a big part of his range. So again, betting small on the turn after c-betting the flop doesn't seem to be a great option. All right, what happens if we check back this turn after c-betting the flop? Well, now getting to the river, if he checks, they're just going to check a lot of hands like ace-3, ace-4, ace-8, whatever. And because they don't float with the weak stuff on the flop, most of the range getting to this river is going to be ace-x. And if we check back the turn, we're just really not going to have any fold equity against ace-x, even if we choose a big size here on this river. So I guess, again, we could just go small on this river to try to fold hands like 7x of clubs or deuce x of clubs, but we're going to lose 2 streets here against ace-x quite a bit. The other problem with checking back this turn is sometimes the villain will just come out and bet the river himself, and we have 10 high, so we just c-bet on the flop, and then we have to fold the river, so we just c-bet, and then I guess we give up and we lose, which again doesn't seem like an amazing option. All right, so here's our summary. What happens if we c-bet? All right, sometimes he folds, which is an instant print for us, right? He folds out better, just like the YouTube commenter said. This is pretty good for us, right? We fold king jack suited, we fold pocket threes. Sometimes he raises, which we just fold 10-9 suited, no big deal. The problem is when we c-bet and he calls, we can't really define his range because this board is so static and dry. They won't call with their weak stuff and raise their strong stuff, so we don't really have a profitable second barrel on turns, no matter if we go big, no matter if we go small, no matter if we check and try to bluff. We just don't really have a profitable decision after c-betting the flop if they call. All right, so let's consider another option here. What happens if we check back on the flop? Well, if we check back, one of 3 things is going to happen. Our opponent is either going to check the turn, he's going to bet small on the turn, or he's going to bet big on the turn. All right, so let's go through these 3 permutations and figure out what happens if. All right, first let's jump into what happens when we check back the flop and now our opponent checks on the turn. So what is our opponent's range when they check here on the turn? And this is why considering alternatives can be so good, because live recreational opponents are going to tell you a lot about their hand strength here going to the turn. When they check on the turn, it probably means their range is going to be quite weak, right? Because when they do have strong ace-x, when they do have sets, when they do have top pair, once we check back on the flop, they just come out and bet on the turn quite a bit. So when they check here on the turn, their range is primarily going to be showdown value, hands like pocket threes, hands like 7x, hands like pocket eights. It's going to be some air, hands just like jack 10 high, king queen high, whatever. And it's also going to be some draws, maybe that they just don't feel comfortable stabbing. Maybe some straight draws like 5, 4, 8, 9, maybe some flush draws, etc. But overall, if they check the turn, their range is going to be weak. So now by checking back on the flop, we have a little bit more information about our opponent's range that we wouldn't have if we c-bet on this particular board. So now we know our opponent probably has a weaker range than they're supposed to have at equilibrium. So now we can just double barrel very big. We can choose a big size here on the turn because our opponent's going to be inelastic with some of their draws to check. If they do have a hand like 7x or pocket eights, they're probably calling once, even if we choose a big size here on the turn. Now we go to the river, and we know here on the river with a pretty decent degree of certainty that our opponents aren't going to have sets. They're not going to have 2 pair. They're not going to have a hand like ace queen that would just come out and bet on the turn a lot. Sure, every once in a while they can just have a weak ace-x hand, a hand like ace 3, ace 4, ace 5, etc. But most of the range is going to be even weaker than that. We can't really run into any brick walls here. We can't really run into 2 pair sets, etc. because those hands would just come out and bet the turn or check raise the turn. So we can just blast here on the river. We can go something like 3x pot, even get them to fold their hands like ace 3, ace 4, ace 5, which we couldn't do on rivers if we c-bet the flop because that did not allow us to define our opponent's range. All right, so we see here when our opponent checks the turn, once again, the range is going to be showdown value and air, so we just get to double barrel and win a lot. What if our opponent bets small on the turn? All right, so once again, we are going to check back on this flop. Now the turn 6 of clubs again, and our opponent comes out and bets half pot or slightly less than half pot here on the turn. First of all, we always want to ask, what is our opponent's range? Well, when they bet small on the turn, the board is starting to get a little bit more draw heavy. There's a flush draw out there There's several straight draws out there. So usually, this has been pretty reliable for me at live low stakes poker. When our opponent comes out and bets small, less than half pot on the turn after we check back the flop, it's usually, once again, going to be a weaker range. Now, there's going to be some ace X in here. There's going to be some hands like ace 10, ace 9, ace 8, etc. But it's usually not going to be two pair. It's not going to be sets, and it's not going to be super strong ace X like ace king or ace queen or ace jack or whatever. It's going to be weaker one pair hands, some draws, some showdown value, some bluffs, etc. It's going to be a weaker range. So what this allows us to do on the turn is essentially float with our entire range here. Even with 10 high, with a gut shot here, we can float on this turn, and then our opponent comes out on the river and they bet half pot again. Now they are just screaming. Our opponent has told us twice in no uncertain terms, excuse me, sir, I do not have a strong hand. So at this point, we can just lay the hammer down. We can raise here on this river because now we further defined our opponent's range. And also, what does our hand look like to our opponent, right? How would fish play pocket aces or pocket sevens if they were in position? Well, they usually like to trap, especially on dry static boards. So our hand looks like, to a fish, it looks like a hand like pocket aces, pocket sevens, pocket deuces, pocket queens, something like that. They just woke up on the river here with a big hand. And since our opponent has told us 2 times they do not have a strong hand, floating the turn and then raising the river if they bet small again, floating the turn and then raising the river allows us to win 2 bets against the weaker portion of the range, where if we just c-bet on the flop, a lot of the stuff would fold. And yes, we would win the pot. We would win 0 against the portion of the range that sometimes just comes out and monkey bets the turn small and then monkey bets the river again, and we just always get to take it away. The other scenario here after checking back the flop is they bet the turn small. We are going to float our range again. Now on the river, they are going to check to us. Well, pretty similar situation here than when they bet the river small. They've told us on the turn they have a weak range by betting small, and now they follow that up by checking on the river. The best hands they're going to have here is like a single pair ace X, like an ace 3 and ace 5. And again, they're just not going to have 2 pair. They're not going to have sets. They're not going to have strong hands when they take this line. So we can just put in the big boy hammer bet here on this river. We're going to need to go very, very big because we're only telling them once that we have a strong hand. So I like to use a 3.5, 4x, even 5x over bet here on this river. Try to get them to fold their weak ace X. And we don't really need to be efficient with our bluff size here because we're just never really concerned about running into a strong hand. All right, so we see here, summary, when our opponent bets small on the turn, their range, once again, going to be pretty weak. It's going to be weak ace X, showdown value, some draws, some air. So we just get to float and we get to bluff the river quite a bit. Whether they check the river, we can bluff, or if they bet the river small or medium themselves, then we can just bluff raise the river if we don't get there. Finally, what happens if we check back the flop and our opponent just comes out and bets big on the turn? We have a pretty easy decision now because our opponents tend to telegraph their hand strength with their bet size. And when they come out and bet big on the turn, what is their range? Well, it's probably going to be strong ace X, some 2 pair, some sets, maybe a straight. It's just going to be a very, very strong range here. And you see, I conveniently changed the cards so we didn't have a gut shot here to make our decision, to make our life a little bit easier. But generally, if our opponent just comes out and bets big on the turn, we're not going to be bluffing this range on the river, even if they check. We're not going to be floating with our entire range on the turn. Our opponent just makes our life easier. They define their range for us when we check back, and we just have a very, very easy fold here. So we see here in summary, once again, what happens if we check? A lot of good things happen. When our opponent has a weak range, we just get to win. And when our opponent has a strong range, we just get let off the hook quite a bit. And we see here, going back to our comparison of the novice player versus the crusher, the novice player comes to a decision. If I c-bet, I get to win. It is good. The crusher simply asks the question, what happens if, and plays out all the permutations. There's a famous chess quote, when you see a good move, look for a better one. Gethen, you like chess, right? All right, next hand here, and this is one of my favorite examples to use, so let's jump into it. A recreational player going to open on the button. We're going to defend in the big blind with 7-6 of diamonds. Flop comes 9-8-3. We check, and our opponent checks back. So we go to a turn, which is an ace, and now most novice players in this spot are going to come out on this turn and think, well, you know, I don't have showdown value. Let's just come out and bet on the turn, because if I bet, I just get to fold out a lot of hands like king high or jack high or pocket fours or whatever, which is really, really good for us when we have 7 high. And yes, that is true, but let's go through and ask these 2 big picture questions. So first, what is the range? Well, I think we can split the range into 3 pretty distinct categories here on this turn. 1, they're going to have a lot of ace X. These hands, ace king, ace queen, ace jack, ace 10. These hands make a lot of sense to check back on the flop because they have showdown value. So they have a lot of top pair. They also have a lot of just like big Broadway cards that didn't connect with this flop. Maybe king, queen suited, king, jack off, hands like that. Just big Broadway cards that didn't didn't connect, didn't really feel comfortable betting on kind of a wet dynamic board. And then finally, they're going to have some underpairs. They're going to have some hands like pocket fours, pocket fives, pocket sixes, maybe even some 8x or stuff like that check back here on the flop. So it's going to be top pair. It's going to be just some king high or queen high type Broadway cards, and it's going to be some showdown value like 8x or underpairs. So now what happens if we come out and just bet on this turn? We get the underpairs to fold, which is good. We can get the 8x to fold, which is good. We get their king highs to fold, which is pretty good again. But when we get called, now we are in quite the pickle, because going to the river, once they call on the turn, their range is going to be a lot of ace x. So we could check on this river when we miss, and we just lost one street against their top pair, which is okay, but not ideal. Or we could bluff on this river, and even if we overbet on this river, a lot of the times our opponent is just going to get there with ace king or ace queen and snap us off. So neither option seems ideal. Now let's consider what happens if we check this turn. Well, if we check it over to our opponent, what are they going to do mostly? They're going to bet. When they have hands like ace king, ace queen, ace jack, those hands are going to put in a bet. And also when they have these Broadway cards like king jack off or king queen or whatever, those hands will often see this card as a good card to stab or barrel, and they will put in kind of a stab or a bluff here when we check it over to them as well. So a lot of their range is just going to bet. And then what we can do once they bet here, now we can go for the big boy check raise. And what this check raise does is, number one, we just got a bet from their Broadway cards, where if we just bet ourselves, those hands would fold. The other nice thing here is that we are telling ace king, ace queen, ace jack, we are telling all these hands in no uncertain terms, you are no good. These hands are no good. By taking a check raise line, we are maximizing fold equity. Check raising maximizes fold equity. Just coming out and betting ourselves minimizes fold equity. Check raising looks so much stronger, allows us to build up the pot. It's how live players generally play their value. So we just look very, very strong here. And even if our opponent calls on the turn, we've now got a 2x pot big boy bluff behind on the river. We can just put all the money in and get our opponent to fold hands like ace king, ace queen, ace jack, because we've told them twice that we have a hand that beats those hands. And in general, when you take this huge check raise and then jam the river, our opponent is probably going to fold most of their single pair ace x. Now, occasionally we do run into some hands like ace 3 or ace 8 that checked back middle or bottom pair on the flop and made 2 pair on the turn. So occasionally we will run into a brick wall here, but I would say the majority of the time we are going to get the fold either on the turn or on the river, which is even better for us. And remember, there are 3 parts of our opponent's range when we check it over to them on the turn. The ace x, which we think is going to stab, some of these king high, queen high Broadway cards that we think are going to stab, and then finally our opponent's also going to have like the showdown value portion of the range, the pocket fours, the pocket sixes, whatever. These hands will probably check back. That's okay, because if they do check back, now we can just come out and overbet the river. We know that our opponent probably doesn't have an ace x hand. Those hands would just come out and bet the turn at a high frequency. So they're just gonna have a lot of hands like pocket fives, pocket fours, 8x, whatever. What does our hand look like when we come out with a huge overbet on this river? Well, it looks like we have ace x. It looks like we have 2 pair. We're still telling a credible story because, you know, we could have been going for the check raise on the turn, and we can just get our opponent to fold the showdown value now if they check back the turn. So now we see here in summary what happens if, right? If we stab the turn, the broadways and small pairs fold, which is good, but the ace x calls and we don't have a profitable double barrel on the river because it will mostly call. If we check the turn, he bets the ace x and we can check raise and max fold equity. He bluffs the broadways, so we get value actually from the broadways that we can now bluff and get to fold. And if he checks back, we just overbet the river to fold the small pairs. In almost all scenarios, when we check the turn, we win. So by going through this what happens if, we can determine that yes, stabbing the turn could be profitable, but checking the turn and going for the check raise or the overbet on the river is probably more profitable. All right, let's look at another one. In this one, our opponent, a rec player on the button, is going to open to 20. We're going to 3-bet in the small blind with the beautiful 10-9 of clubs, and our opponent is going to call. Flop comes queen jack 4, so we do flop an open ender here. And again, let's start off by asking these big picture questions. What is their range and what happens if? So the range is still going to be relatively wide. Maybe looks something like this. This is a button defend range to a small blind 3-bet. It's not perfect, but it is a good starting point. We see here, probably not gonna have aces, kings. These hands would just 4-bet. Probably not gonna have the weaker part of their range because these hands wouldn't open and then call 3-bet, whatever. They have about 15, 16% of their hands. We could quibble with this, make it a little bit tighter, make it a little bit wider, but it is a decent starting point for what their range is going to look like when we 3-bet in the small blind. All right, so now let's go through what happens if. So what happens if we c-bet here? Well, we just get to fold out a lot of their better hands, right? We get to fold out some ace highs, we get to fold out deuces, threes, pocket fives through pocket tens quite a bit here. We get a lot of folds from better hands, which is pretty good. But what happens if our opponent calls? Well, we have equity, so maybe we decide to continue double barreling on the turn and our opponent calls again. Now we get to the river and we just have 10 high here. So if we check on this river, we've lost 2 streets against all of our opponent's range. It's just going to win here. If we bet small on this river, maybe we get some of the ace high and king high flush draws to fold, but we get snapped off by the queen X and jack X, which we lose 3 streets against. And if we bet big on this river, well, we just get snapped off by the strong portions of our opponent's range. And the problem is here, when our opponent is in position, when we are out of position, betting small on the flop doesn't necessarily define our opponent's range, because opponents slow play much more when they are in position, even if the board is wet and dynamic. They just have way less anxiety when they're in position about bad turn cards coming that kill their action. In my experience, players just slow play strong hands so much more when they are in position. Early on, when Hungry Horse Poker was just starting as a stable, we had 20-something players all over the country, and our default, like it is right now, was when we were in position, we're just c-betting our entire range. But when we were out of position at that time, we were actually c-betting our entire range as well, because we're just like, well, players respond poorly to range bets, so let's just c-bet our entire range. And one of the things that kept happening to our horses is they would just triple barrel in spots like this and just get snapped off by hands like pocket jacks or queen jack or pocket fours. And they're like, well, our opponents didn't raise on a wet dynamic flop. And finally, after seeing this over and over again, we just came to our senses and realized that the population slow plays quite a bit when they are in position, where they almost never slow play on this board when they are out of position. All right, so now let's go through what happens if we check. If our opponent checks back on this flop, what does this mean? Well, we found even though opponents will not necessarily fast play all the time when we take aggressive action ourselves, when we bet, even if we bet small, when we check, our opponents still massively overstab their good hands, right? They just want to start putting money in the pot when they have strong stuff like pocket fours or queen jack or ace queen or whatever. So when our opponent checks back the flop, they just have a relatively weak range. In general, they usually don't have top pair, they don't have 2 pair, they don't have sets. So the best hands you're going to have are hands like ace jack here that are not going to be able to hang on. So if our opponent checks back the flop, we just put in a big bet on the turn to target all of our opponent's showdown value. It's going to call once, and then we just empty the clip on the river, go for the big boy overbet. We're just not going to run into brick walls here, because just in general, our opponents do not check back strong hands even when they're in position. When we check to them on wet dynamic boards, they just tend to bet their good stuff themselves when we check to them. So we just have a very profitable double barrel bluff when our opponents check back the flop. All right, so what happens if we check it over and our opponent bets small? Well, now again, we have a little bit more information about our opponent's range. Live players in particular tend to split their sizes, particularly when the board is wet and dynamic, such as this board here. And when they choose a small size, they just tend to have a little bit of a weaker range. They just don't have as much ace queen, queen jack, pocket jacks, pocket fours in the small size. Now, this doesn't mean they never have strong hands in the small size. It just means they don't have nearly enough strong hands. So yeah, sometimes we can run into a brick wall here, but in general, we're going to have some fold equity here, and the more fold equity we have, the less equity in our own hand we need. So because we think we've got quite a bit of fold equity here, we can just check raise the flop and we can just jam a bunch of turns. Our opponent just doesn't have nearly as strong a range as if they would bet big here. So we can just go for the check raise. We can get a lot of folds. And finally, what happens if we check and our opponent goes big? Well, they're just screaming, I have a strong hand, right? I have ace queen, I have queen jack, I have pocket fours. So we're not going to have any fold equity here when our opponent stabs big. So in this particular case, we would not want to put in a check raise. We just want to check call here and try to realize our equity on the turn or the river. So we see here our summary. What happens if in this particular hand, if we c-bet, well, we get our opponent to fold small pocket pairs, which is good. But the problem comes when our opponent calls, because they call with a bunch of better hands and draws. We don't really have a profitable triple barrel bluffing opportunity here when our opponents are in position, because they don't necessarily define their range when we bet ourselves. What happens if we check? Well, if our opponent checks back, our bluffs print. If our opponent bets small, we can just check raise quite a bit versus a weak range. And if our opponent bets large, we can just check call with our open-ended straight draw, because we now know that our opponent has a pretty strong range. All right, this next hand here, we are playing against an aggressive kind of spazzy pro. This guy is playing for profit, but he's very aggressive. We are going to 3-bet in the small blind with pocket Kigley's dream scenario, and he is going to call. Flop comes 9-6-5 with 3 clubs, and we're playing against recreational players. I'm just going to check my entire range here. We've already talked about recreational players make a ton of mistakes versus a check here. They tend to telegraph their hand strength with their bet size, but we're not playing against a recreational player. We are playing against a pro. My shortcut against pros is just try to execute a simple strategy. On boards that tend to be good for my opponent's range, I'm going to check my entire range. On boards that tend to be slightly better for my range, I'm just going to bet my entire range. When playing against pros, I'm going to have a little bit more nuanced strategy, but still keeping it very, very, very simple. No need to overcomplicate this. This board, kind of a connected, monotone board. I'm probably just going to be checking my entire range, particularly because our opponent is aggressive. And I think an aggressive opponent is generally going to make betting mistakes rather than calling mistakes. So I'd like to give our opponent a chance to make those mistakes. So I'm just going to check everything here. Our opponent's going to bet small. Our hand probably not strong enough to check raise, but definitely too good to fold. So we are just going to call here, going to a turn, which is a 3, and our opponent checks it back. We get to the river, which is a 3 pairing the board, and we've kind of flown through this hand to get to this point because I want to focus on the river in this hand. Let's ask those 2 questions. First, what is our opponent's range? Well, we can rule out very strong hands like flushes, like full houses. Those hands would generally just keep betting the turn, particularly from an aggressive player. If he had a king high flush, an ace high flush, are those hands going to bet the flop and check back the turn? No. If he had a straight, are those hands going to bet the flop and check back the turn? No, probably not. If he had a set, are those hands going to bet the flop and check back the turn? No. So we can rule out the top of his range here. So what is he going to have? He's going to have a lot of kind of thin value, showdown value-y hands. Maybe he has some hands like pocket 8s, pocket 7s, 10-9 suited, or jack 9 suited, right? He's going to have a lot of kind of thin value hands that didn't really feel comfortable going for 3 streets. That's going to be a pretty big part of his range. The other part of his range is maybe a little bit of air. Now, it's probably not going to be hands that had a lot of equity on the turn. Maybe a hand like ace 10 with the ace of clubs. That hand from an aggressive player would just keep betting. So it's not going to be stuff like that, but maybe just complete whiffs, right? Maybe hands like jack 10 of hearts or queen 10 of spades. Why might he have these hands? Because, well, these hands stabbed on the flop, they picked up nothing on the turn, and even aggressive players don't really feel comfortable just triple barreling in live poker when they just have air, when they have no equity, when they have no backup. So in general, I think we can split our opponent's range into 2 categories. Once again, going to be some thin value hands and going to be some air. So now what happens if? What happens if we bet on this river? Well, our opponent is probably going to call quite a bit if they have the 9x, the pocket 8s, the pocket 7s, etc. Because what does our hand look like when we check call the flop and then check the turn? It looks like we just have a lot of hands like ace king and ace queen. So we're going to get paid here from his thin value if we just come out and bet. But what does he do with his air? Well, he just folds. So we win a bet against his kind of thin value or showdown value if we come out and bet here, but the air portion of his range just folds. So now what happens if we check this river? Well, now our opponent, we've given him a ton of rope. So I think that air portion of his range, the queen high, jack high, those type of hands, if we check this river, what does our hand look like? Well, it looks like we got ace king, ace queen, ace jack, something like that just check called the flop. So what is our opponent going to do with the air portion of his range? We said this guy was aggressive. We said he was spazzy. We said he's probably likely to make betting mistakes. He's probably just going to bet when he does have air. What is he going to do with the thin value portion of his range? If he has a hand like jack 9 suited or pocket 8s getting to this river, those hands are probably also going to bet for thin value. This is a pro, right? Pros are capable of betting for thin value and they are capable of bluffing, right? This would not be the case if it was a recreational player or a fish most of the time, but pros are capable of these things. Why might he bet a hand like pocket 8s here on this river? Well, our hand looks like ace king or ace queen, right? We check called the flop, check on the turn, and now we're checking on the river. It just doesn't look like we have a good hand ever. So I think our opponent with a high certainty is very likely to bet both his air and his thin value on this river. So we see here, going back to our chart, what happens if we bet the river? Well, he calls the thin value and he folds the air. What happens if we check the river? Well, he bets the thin value and he bets the air. So again, by going through what happens if, when you see a good move, look for a better one. All right, final hand here. In this one, we're playing 5-10 instead of 5-5. We open on the button with king 5 of hearts, and a recreational player in the big blind is going to call. Flop comes jack 7-6. I'm just going to choose the size where they raise their strong stuff and call with their weak stuff. Notice on this board, because it is wet and dynamic, we can accomplish that with a small size, whereas in the first hand on the board where it was ace 7 deuce, our opponent isn't going to call with their weak stuff or raise their strong stuff. On this board, it is much more likely that we can accomplish that. So we are going to go $40 and our opponent calls. We go to a turn, which is a jack here. And now the first question we want to ask on this turn is, what is our opponent's range? So we can put our opponent's range in kind of 3 buckets. It's going to be a lot of jack X for trips. That makes a lot of sense. It's going to be the strong portion of our opponent's range. These hands would always call on the flop. They wouldn't raise most of the time. So a lot of jack X, a lot of trips. It's going to be some showdown value. 7X, 6X, pocket 8s, pocket 9s, etc. It's going to be some draws, maybe some flush draws, maybe some 8-9 or 5-4 or 9-10. So it's going to be trips, showdown value, and draws. So now let's go through what happens if. Let's start off if we bet big on this turn, right? If we just pot the turn or overbet the turn, what does our opponent do? Well, when our opponent has a jack, when we just just come out and bet big on this turn, mostly our opponent's probably just going to call, particularly if they have a hand like Jack 9, Jack 10, Queen Jack, etc. Maybe they raise sometimes with hands like Ace Jack and King Jack, but in general, the bigger we bet, the less our opponent's fast play. So I think by choosing this big size on the turn, our opponent's just going to call and flat quite a bit with their Jack X. When our opponent has showdown value, they may put us on a draw. Maybe sometimes they call, sometimes they fold. If our opponent has a hand like 8s, 9s, 10s, I think those hands maybe call one more time. Maybe a hand like Ace 7 calls one more time. Maybe we can get the weak 7X. Maybe we get the 6X. Maybe we get pocket 5s or pocket 4s. Maybe we get some of that stuff to fold. But in general, I think this is probably going to be a mix here. I think the showdown value portion of our opponent's range sometimes calls, sometimes folds. And then the draws here from our opponent, again, I think that's going to be a mix as well. The stronger draws may call, the weaker draws may fold. So the problem here getting to this river after our opponent calls, our opponent just has a very strong range. It's going to be predominantly Jack X, right? So we don't really have a profitable bluff once we bet big on the turn because we have not defined, we have not sculpted our opponent's range getting to this river. And if we bet small on the river, well, we just get snapped off by the trips and any showdown value that got here. Pocket 10s, pocket 9s, 7X, etc. And maybe we fold the ace high flush draws, but there's just not a ton of those. So betting small on the river doesn't seem great. Betting big on the river doesn't seem great because we just get snapped off by the trips. What happens if we check back the turn? Okay, well now we go to a river and let's say our opponent checks. And I think still at some frequency, if our opponent checks on this river, they could have Jack X some of the time, just trying to trap us, trying to induce here some of the time, trying to get us to stab. Even if we just try to get our opponent to fold hands like pocket 8s, pocket 9s, 7X, I don't think we're going to be very successful doing that because we look kind of weak when we check back the turn. On these paired boards, our opponents gets more sticky. So we're going to have to choose a really big size here if we want to fold a hand like pocket 8s. And the problem with choosing a big size on this river is our opponents are just going to trap sometimes with hands like Ace Jack, King Jack, etc. getting to this river. So we're just going to get snapped off quite a bit by the top of our opponent's range. The other scenario that happens when we check back the turn is our opponent just comes out and bets on the river, which I guess now is okay because we don't really lose another bet against the top of their range and get put in a quandary on the river. But oftentimes when we brick the river, we just have to fold our king high. Finally, what if we bet small here on this turn? And when we bet small, a few things happen. Number one, when our opponent does have a jack, when we bet small on this turn, the board is wet and dynamic, we've chosen a small size, our opponents will generally just tend to fast play when they have trips here on this turn. So we just kind of know what our opponent's range is. If we have a king high flush draw here, obviously we can just call. We're getting the odds to hit the flush on the river. Our opponents are not really going to have full houses here because hands like pocket 7s or pocket 6s or Jack 7 suited or whatever would raise on the flop. So we're kind of getting the odds to just hit our flush on the river. Then if we get there, we can get paid. So we can do quite a lot of calling here. And if our opponent just calls here, we know with a pretty high certainty that our opponent's going to have a weaker range getting to the river because the Jack X just raises a lot when we choose a small size. The other cool thing is that by choosing the small size, we just make our opponent's range wider getting to the river. They're going to have their straight draws. They're going to have all their flush draws. They're going to have a lot of their 6X, all their 7X, etc. So we just have kind of a weaker range to bluff on the river. We know they don't have full houses because 7s and 6s would mostly raise the flop. We know they don't have Jack X because Jack X would mostly raise the turn. We're not really worried about running into a brick wall here on this river. And even though our opponents get more sticky on these paired boards, we're just not really worried about running into super strong hands. So we can go for the big boy overbet and get our opponent to fold their entire range here on this river. Once again, quick summary, what happens if we bet big? Well, Jack X calls. Showdown value sometimes folds, sometimes calls, and draws sometimes fold and sometimes call. When we check, well, when they check river, we have no fold equity. And when they bet river, we're kind of in a pickle. We just have to fold. But what happens if we bet small? Jack X raises, showdown value calls, draws call. We just get to play perfectly because we have now defined their range. All right, guys, so remember to play like a crusher, 2 questions. What is their range and what happens if? That's it. You don't need software. You don't need solvers. You don't even need the amazing 28-day boot camp from Hungry Horse Poker. No. You can do this on your own. Now, can we help refine your thought process and get you there faster? Yes, of course. But you guys can do this on your own. Plenty of crushers have. Hopefully this helps and turns you into the biggest boy possible. Thank you guys and have a gentle day.